In 2024, Jews still face widespread discrimination, hostility, and even violence in several parts of the world. With just 15.7 million Jews globally, why are some countries so dangerous for them? From extreme anti-Semitic rhetoric to violent extremist groups, certain nations continue to make life unbearable for Jews. In this video, we'll explore the top 10 countries where Jews are least welcome in 2024. Stay tuned and prepare to be shocked by what's happening in the world. But before move video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting insights, with not just Athens in the background but Rome also surrounding this perpetual voyage. Number 10, Sudan. The population stands at around 45 million, but its Jewish community is virtually non-existent. Historically, Sudan had a small Jewish presence, but over time state-sponsored anti-Semitism and political instability led to the near extinction of Jews in the country. Following Sudan's independence, many Jews were forced to leave due to rising hostility. The relationship between Sudan and Israel worsened, further alienating the Jewish community. The country's political instability, especially after the ousting of Omar al-Bashir, has led to more conflicts and extremist factions gaining power. These groups have contributed to a hostile environment for any minority, including Jews. Despite some attempts to normalize relations with Israel, Sudan remains a dangerous place for Jews. With the rise of Islamist extremists in the region, there is little hope for any Jewish community to thrive. Sudan's state policies have perpetuated anti-Semitism, even in the modern era. International reports have shown that Sudanese government rhetoric includes anti-Jewish sentiments that encourage societal hostility. Jewish heritage sites have been desecrated, and any traces of Jewish life have been erased. Even if Jews were to return, the deep-rooted prejudice would make it virtually impossible for them to live openly. The cultural erasure of Jews in Sudan is evident in the country's history of mass expulsions and violent discrimination. With no organized Jewish community left, Sudan's future for religious minorities is bleak. As the nation deals with its internal issues, there's little attention given to the rights of religious minorities like Jews. Sudan stands as a prime example of how political instability and extreme rhetoric can drive out religious minorities. For Jews, Sudan represents a lost opportunity as the nation continues to deny any space for Jewish life or cultural preservation. Number 9, Afghanistan, with a population of 40 million, had a small but historically significant Jewish community that is now non-existent. The Jewish presence in Afghanistan dates back thousands of years, especially in Kabul, where Jews lived peacefully until the mid-20th century. However, as political turmoil escalated, starting with the rise of the Soviet Union in the 1970s, most Jews fled the country. With the Soviet invasion in 1979 and the subsequent civil wars, Jews were forced to leave, and those who remained faced persecution. When the Taliban first rose to power in the 1990s, it further decimated the Jewish population. The Taliban's strict interpretation of Islam offered no tolerance for Jews, leading to the destruction of Jewish property and the expulsion of the community. In recent years, Afghanistan's political situation has only worsened. The resurgence of the Taliban in 2021 further marginalized any remaining minorities, including Jews. The Taliban's oppressive laws leave little room for religious diversity, especially for Jews. Reports indicate that Jewish heritage sites have been destroyed, and any effort to preserve Jewish culture in Afghanistan has been futile. Today, Afghanistan is a place where Jews can neither live nor practice their faith openly. The country's descent into extremism and the Taliban's iron grip on power make it clear that there is no future for Jews in Afghanistan. The political instability and the rise of radical ideologies have ensured that Jews have no place in Afghan society. Thus, Afghanistan remains one of the most dangerous places for Jews, where any semblance of their rich historical presence has been wiped out. The country's extreme policies toward non-Moscows have left no room for Jews to exist within its borders. Number 8, Pakistan, with a population of 230 million, has fewer than 100 Jews left. The country's hostility toward Jews is well documented, driven largely by its political stance against Israel. Anti-Semitism is rampant, fueled by anti-Israel sentiment and public discourse that paints Jews as enemies of the state. Even though Pakistan has a small Jewish population, they live in constant fear of persecution. The societal environment in Pakistan is hostile to Jews, with widespread discrimination in education, media, and employment. Jews face harassment and are often pressured to hide their identity to avoid becoming targets of violence. Government policies, while officially promoting religious tolerance, often fail to protect religious minorities, like Jews, from the intense societal hatred they face. Pakistani media and educational systems often perpetuate harmful stereotypes about Jews, further embedding anti-Semitic attitudes in society. The country's foreign policy against Israel only adds fuel to the fire, leading to heightened tensions within the population. Jews, if they openly identify as such, are at risk of physical and emotional harm. Despite Pakistan's official recognition of religious freedom, this is rarely reflected in practice, especially for Jews. The small Jewish community has been forced to live in secrecy, with no public presence or recognition. Any attempt to practice Judaism openly in Pakistan invites scorn, and the community is all but invisible in the public sphere. Pakistan's future for Jews is grim, as the rise of radical ideologies and the continued political hostility toward Israel have made life increasingly difficult. For Jews, Pakistan remains an inhospitable country, where survival means erasing one's identity. Number 7, Libya. With a population of around 7 million, once had a thriving Jewish community, but today it is virtually non-existent. The Jewish community in Libya was decimated after the creation of Israel in 1948, with many Jews forced to flee due to state-pacified satisfying anti-Semitism. The country's policies under Muammar Gaddafi further marginalized Jews, leading to the near destruction of the Jewish presence. Gaddafi's regime encouraged the expulsion of Jews and the confiscation of their property, making Libya an incredibly hostile place for the Jewish community. After his ousting in 2011, Libya fell into chaos and extremist groups gained power, making the country even more dangerous for Jews. Any remaining Jewish heritage sites were often destroyed or repurposed by radical factions. Libya's political instability has created a haven for extremism, where Jews as well as other minorities are at risk. The rise of radical Islamist groups in the region has only made the situation worse. With no central government or stable power structure, Jews are left with little chance of returning or establishing a safe community in Libya. The Jewish community in Libya has been erased from the nation's history. Jewish cemeteries and synagogues, once symbols of the community's heritage, have been desecrated and destroyed. The political vacuum and rise of militant factions have ensured that Libya is a hostile place for Jews, making it impossible for any Jewish presence to remain. Libya's future is uncertain, but for Jews the country represents a lost chapter in history. The conflict and extremism that now define Libya have left no room for Jews, and it is unlikely that they will ever return to the country. Libya's treatment of Jews is a reminder of how political instability and radical ideologies can eradicate entire communities. Number 6, Iraq. With a population of about 40 million, once had a significant Jewish population, but that community is now virtually non-existent. The Jewish presence in Iraq dates back to the time of the Babylonian Empire, but over the last century, the community has been decimated. The rise of Arab nationalism and the creation of Israel led to widespread anti-Semitic policies and violence against Jews. By the time of Saddam Hussein's reign, the Jewish community had already dwindled and most of the remaining Jews fled Iraq. The fall of Saddam Hussein and the subsequent political instability made Iraq an even more dangerous place for Jews. The rise of extremist groups like ISIS further targeted religious minorities, including Jews, causing any remaining Jewish presence to vanish. Iraq's history of anti-Semitism is deeply ingrained, with the government and local populations perpetuating harmful stereotypes about Jews. Even today, Iraq is a country where Jews cannot live openly, and any expression of Jewish identity is met with hostility. The government has done little to protect its Jewish heritage, and Jewish sites have been destroyed. The Iraq War further exacerbated the situation for Jews. While the war aimed to liberate Iraq, it led to an environment where extremist groups thrived, and minorities, including Jews, faced severe persecution. The rise of these groups left little hope for Jews to ever return to Iraq. Iraq remains one of the most dangerous places for Jews, as the combination of political instability, extremist factions, and deeply rooted anti-sentiment ensures that Jews will never have a place in the country again. The erasure of Jewish life in Iraq is a tragic result of years of violence and oppression. Number 5. Lebanon, with a population of approximately 6 million, once had a vibrant Jewish community, but today it is almost non-existent. Lebanon's Jews were once active in commerce and politics, but following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, most Jews fled to escape rising anti-Semitism. The civil war in Lebanon in 1975 and 1990s further decimated the Jewish population, leaving only a handful remaining. Lebanon's political instability has worsened over the decades, and the country's association with Hezbollah has contributed to the growing hostility toward Jews. Hezbollah's anti-Israel stance has further isolated the Jewish community, and the Lebanese government's inability to maintain security has made the situation even worse. The small Jewish community that remained in Lebanon has long since disappeared. The country's economic decline, combined with religious extremism, has pushed out many religious minorities, including Jews. Reports of harassment and intimidation of Jews in Lebanon have become more common as radical groups have gained influence. Lebanon's religious landscape is dominated by Muslim factions, with little tolerance for Jews or other non-Muslim minorities. Lebanon's policies, while officially promoting religious tolerance, often fall short in protecting minorities. For Jews, Lebanon is a place where their presence is almost invisible, and any sign of Jewish identity is met with suspicion or hostility. With Hezbollah's increasing control, the future for any Jewish life in Lebanon is bleak. Lebanon's rapid decline into sectarianism and extremism has made it clear that Jews have no future in the country. The erasure of Jewish communities from Lebanon's history is a painful reminder of how political and religious conflict can decimate a minority group. Number 4. Saudi Arabia, with a population of approximately 35 million, has a negligible Jewish population, mostly consisting of foreign workers. The country's state-sponsored policies and strict interpretation of Islam have made it an extremely hostile environment for Jews. Saudi Arabia has no formal diplomatic relations with Israel, and anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in both the government and society. Saudi Arabia's religious intolerance, especially toward Jews, is promoted through state-sponsored media, educational systems, and official statements. Anti-Semitic tropes are often propagated, and any form of Jewish identity is met with hostility. There are no known synagogues or Jewish religious institutions in the country, making it clear that Saudi Arabia is a place where Jews cannot openly practice their faith. While Saudi Arabia has made some efforts to moderate its image, especially in recent years with its Vision 2030 initiative, these changes have not translated into a more inclusive society for Jews. The strict Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, which dominates the country, remains adamantly opposed to any non-Muslim religious presence, particularly Jews. Reports from human rights organizations continue to highlight discrimination against Jews in Saudi Arabia. Even foreign Jews living in the country face discrimination and harassment. The absence of Jewish heritage sites, combined with the government's lack of protections for minorities, paints a grim picture for Jews in Saudi Arabia. They represent an example of how state policy and religious intolerance can prevent any Jewish presence from thriving. The country's political and social landscape continues to be inhospitable for Jews, making it a place where Jewish life is entirely absent. Number 3, Yemen, with a population of approximately 30 million, has a Jewish community of fewer than 50 individuals, making it one of the smallest in the region. Yemen once had a thriving Jewish community, particularly in the capital Sana'a. But decades of discrimination, persecution, and forced conversions have decimated the population. The majority of Yemen's Jews left during the 20th century, fleeing rising anti-Semitism and violence. The ongoing civil war in Yemen, which began in 2014, has only worsened the situation for religious minorities. With extremist groups such as the Houthis gaining power, Jews have faced increasing levels of violence and intimidation. Many Jews who remain in Yemen are forced to hide their identity, as the country has no official protection for minorities and the general atmosphere is hostile toward them. Yemen's historical anti-Semitism has been compounded by the rise of radical ideologies in recent years. The Houthi rebels, who have taken control of much of the country, are known for their extreme positions, including their persecution of Jews. Reports of forced conversions and violence against Jews have been common since the outbreak of the civil war. Jews in Yemen have faced consistent discrimination for centuries, and their situation has only worsened with the current conflict. The few remaining Jews live in constant fear of persecution, and their way of life is under constant threat from extremist groups. Yemen is a country where Jews have no space to live freely or practice their religion. Yemen's future as a haven for Jews seems unlikely, as the country's instability and extreme religious ideologies make it impossible for Jews to have a future there. With little international support for the Jewish community, the few Jews left in Yemen are left to live in hiding and fear. Number 2, Syria, with a population of around 18 million, had a Jewish population that once numbered in the tens of thousands. However, over the decades, due to political turmoil, state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and the rise of extremist groups, Syria's Jewish community has been virtually wiped out. Today there are virtually no Jews left in the country, and those who were once part of Syria's Jewish community fled during the late 20th century. The rise of the Assad regime in the 1970s and 1980s brought about severe repression of religious minorities, including Jews. During this period, Jews were systematically oppressed, their property confiscated, and many forced to leave the country. The regime's ties to anti-Israel rhetoric only worsened the environment for Jews, making it impossible for them to remain. The outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 further devastated the Jewish community. Extremist factions, including ISIS, took control of large parts of Syria and further targeted religious minorities. Jewish heritage sites were destroyed, and the last remnants of Jewish life in Syria vanished under the weight of war and radicalism. The political instability and extremism in Syria have left no room for Jews to live or practice their religion. The country's descent into civil war has driven out all religious minorities, including Jews, and any attempt to preserve Jewish culture has been crushed. Syria is a place where Jews can no longer survive. Syria's future holds little hope for Jews, as the nation remains entrenched in political violence, sectarian conflict, and religious extremism. With no space for Jews in the public or private sphere, Syria has effectively erased its Jewish community, leaving it a ghost of its former self. Number 1, Iran, with a population of approximately 84 million, is home to the largest Jewish community in the Middle East outside of Israel, numbering around 1,000,000. While there is a small Jewish population, the country's state population, anti-Semitism, political rhetoric, and hostile stance toward Israel have made it a difficult place for Jews to live. Iranian Jews face discrimination, surveillance, and restrictions on practicing their religion. The Iranian government uses anti-Semitic rhetoric as a political tool to maintain its power. Jews are often vilified in state-run media, and their community is subjected to constant scrutiny. The Iranian regime's strong anti-Israel stance has fostered a climate of hostility toward its Jewish citizens, and Jewish schools and synagogues are often under surveillance. While Jews in Iran are allowed to practice their religion, they are heavily restricted. They face limits on religious freedom, including restrictions on building new synagogues or traveling freely. The Jewish community in Iran is often used as a pawn in the country's political narrative, and Jewish life is constantly under threat. The situation for Jews in Iran is further complicated by the rise of extremist factions within the country. With hardline religious ideologies on the rise, the Jewish community is often seen as an enemy of the state. Jews are subjected to violence, harassment, and forced conformity to the Iranian government's ideals. While Iran has a Jewish population, the country remains one of the most hostile in the world for Jews. With state-sponsored anti-Semitism, political repression, and religious persecution, Iran is a place where Jews must navigate constant threats to their safety and identity. In 2024, several countries remain hostile to Jewish communities, where anti-Semitism continues to be a significant issue. Factors like political unrest, economic instability, and rising extremism contribute to these challenges. While some nations are working to combat discrimination, many still fail to provide a safe and welcoming environment for Jews. The ongoing fight against hate requires international cooperation, education, and local activism to ensure Jewish populations can live without fear of persecution. Only time will tell if these countries will change or if anti-Semitism will persist.